My name is Pat Wasley. I'm the Dean of the College of Education and at the University of Washington. And it's been a great privilege for me to be at this institution where the Center for Multicultural Education is housed and does its work each year. And I know that many of you come from around our state, but I appreciate the traveling from schools and school districts and other institutions. And the panelists have come from across the country. So for all of the time that it takes to gather, we're so grateful for your willingness. I spent the night last night, excuse me, morning, Troy. I spent the night last night re-watching Spike Lee's film and looking through the curriculum guide in order to get ready to say good morning and welcome to you. And I found myself getting more and more and more upset instead of relieved. And what happened for me in watching the film again, so two things happened. One was that I am reminded again and again through the film how easy it is for those of us who either live in a different part of the country, come from a different racial background, come from a different socioeconomic background, to forget the suffering of other people in our country, in our own country. When the levees broke, I was in Norway, and with other teacher educators and in a partnership that we have where we exchange students with the university in Norway. One of the reasons our students are of value to the Norwegians at Trondheim University is that they understand better how to work with children from diverse backgrounds, and Norway is experiencing an influx of people from around the world, and it's new for them. So they were very happy to have this partnership with us. At the same time, at the dinner tables during that week that I was in Norway, they hammered us about how it was that we could allow this to happen in our own country in a way that no one in this country hammered on me, right? So it is unbelievable to me that we still, after all these years and after after our stance in other countries' human rights violations, can be so appallingly backwards and inattentive. It's just shocking. So that was the first cheery reaction to the film. And then the second thing that the film did for me was to make me think again all night long about how upsetting the election is right now. I have had it, so the film puts in again in relief how unable we are as a country to speak about race, and how unable we have been to take Barack Obama's speech seriously. People have either embraced it or said it didn't do it. It wasn't good enough. Instead of understanding that what he presented to us was complexity. So that in the long run has made me entirely much more grateful for the work that you've done, all of you, and for the work that you're doing to help people understand how to build the capacity to discuss really difficult issues in our society. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panelists, and I am most appreciative that we'll be able to learn from you today. So.
Thank you very much, Dean Wasley. I want to start by saying we're so deeply grateful to Dean Wasley, who I can't say enough good things about. A wonderful dean, inspirational leader, who's just always been strongly supportive of the Center for Multicultural Education. Diversity in this college, we've never been as diverse as we are in terms of our faculty. So thank you, Dean Wasley, for all that you do. Plus, she's brought us from rating number 25, I think, in the national ratings when she came. We're now number 7 this year. And so we're very grateful for our very inspirational leader. Let me just and would the panelists please come up and take your seats? Let me just briefly introduce the panel, then I'm going to get out of the way. The program is printed out for you, can follow it. All of these people are famous, and we don't have time to, they wouldn't be here if they weren't. The center only deals with the first-class scholars. from around the world. I think we have that reputation. So be assured, but I do want to mention Going Down Jericho's Road, Mike Honey's book. It's a powerful biography of King's last campaign. But they all have books. They're all famous, so take my word for it. Margaret Smith Crocco, my dear, dear friend from Columbia University, Teachers College, is a distinguished social studies educator who's done pioneering work on gender and race. Mike Honey, our distinguished professor from Tacoma, he holds an endowed chair there, and we're just so honored that he took that long drive in the morning.
Bus ride.
Walter Parker, a distinguished social science educator, I like to remind, when he does all the good things he does, I like to remind him that he was once a student in my seminar for social studies education. So Walter, all the good things you do, I take a little of the credit. Joy Williamson, whom we stole from Stanford, has a wonderful new book that we did a book talk on just a couple weeks ago. We're so delighted. She's a shining star. We're so grateful to have her here. So having said all of this, I'll turn it over to either Walter or Margaret. Margaret, I guess, goes next. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It's really lovely to be here, and I want to thank everyone who's made it possible, and in particular, Dean Wasley and Professor Banks. I thought we'd start this morning with a 10-minute clip from Act 3, Scene 3 of the film. That it's a section that's entitled Citizens, American Citizens, and it really does tie in quite centrally to the theme of our curriculum. Then, having shown that, I would say we'll go on to a PowerPoint that I'll try to keep brief, just to give you some background as to how the curriculum took shape, and then we will move towards the panel. All right, so let's...
People in New Orleans stay here. Culturally, we stay here. We don't venture further than the city. It's always hard to get people to leave.
I want to go back home because that's where I was born, and I wanted to stay there all my life. And I still want to visit other places, but that's my main place now.
There's a lot of people from New Orleans. We're so sick, we don't even know what to do. We don't even know where to go. We're so used to New Orleans, we born and raised there. Where are we gonna go? You know, I mean, we like, you know, they had the nerve to call us refugees.
Tens of thousands of refugees.
Refugees, or an untold number of refugees.
The refugees.
Refugees.
Refugees. The Astrodome is refugee ready.
It's a very strange thing to see people that look like people you know, or see people that look like people in your family on television, and they're being talked about as if they're refugees or homeless people. And that was hard to take.
When I heard they call us refugees, I couldn't do nothing but drop my head. Because I see I'm a United States citizen of America, call me a refugee.
What kind of shit is that, man? Refugees. They were referring to when this thing first had people leaving New Orleans. They were refugees. Damn, when the storm came in, that blew away our citizenship too. We forgot we weren't American citizens anymore. What kind of shit is that? In the media and people on the street, refugees. I thought that was folks that didn't have a country, man. That didn't have anywhere. You know,
we are calling on the media to stop calling them refugees. These are American citizens that in most cases were very viable taxpayers. And the inference, the connotation of refugees is like they are some others from somewhere lost needing charity. I think the most shocking display of insensitivity that I saw was when Barbara Bush, the former First Lady, the president's mama, let's put it straight up, was touring the Houston Astrodome with her husband, former President Bush, and former President Clinton. And in the height of insensitivity, if not just outright bias, she says, well, these people are living better than ever. Some of them, it ended up good for them. They ended up making out all right.
What I'm hearing, which is sort of scary, is they all want to stay in Texas. Everybody is so overwhelmed by the hospitality. And so many of the people in the arenas here, you know, were underprivileged anyway. This is working very roughly.
I mean, and Clinton says nothing. Bush says nothing. We have had black leaders denounced by the U.S. Senate for less. This woman acted like this was some kind of social upward mobility.
My phone number is 504-919-8699. Tell her, call me and say that shit.
As you say, our poor, everything I got it honest. You are rich. How did you get there?
504, and I ain't Mike Jones, I'm Phyllis Montana LeBlanc. Call me, 504-919-8699, New Orleans area code. My phone works now.
She's the present mama of America. And that's what she thinks of the citizens of New Orleans. So you wonder why he was slow responding? Well, if he talks to his mother, he was doing us a favor.
This is such a rich country, it always has the money to do what it thinks is very important. If we want to put a man on the moon, if we want to go to Mars, we find the money. We want to fight a war in Iraq, which costs billions of dollars every month, we do it. You know, it's really a question of priorities and what we think is important.
Martin Luther King Jr. said, don't flip a coin to me as a beggar and expect that to do. That's generosity. That's charity. King said, when you're on the Jericho Road, don't just help the brother on the Jericho Road. That's good, but that's charity. He said, here's justice. Ask why it is on the Jericho Road the guy still keeps getting mugged. Not only him, but other people. He said, pretty soon you've got to transform the Jericho Road. That's what we got to do in America. So this dispersal of black people only highlights the degree to which we failed to transform the Jericho Road.
Oh my God, this is beautiful.
Kathy Phipps signed a lease on a house. That means a lease on a new life.
Oh, bless your soul.
She's moving into a community that's embracing her with open arms. When we first met Kathy, she was a hurricane evacuee, surprised to find herself in Utah.
Utah?
She learned her kids made it to a shelter in Texas.
Mama's right here. I'm safe, but I'm alive. I'm not dead. I'm coming to get you.
And Kathy was reunited with her 8-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old son. Kathy had made a huge decision.
We got him.
She'd take her kids with her to the state that embraced her. The mountains of Utah are a long way from the bayous of Louisiana.
Look like I went through this hurricane and came to heaven.
Heaven is a 4-bedroom house on a pristine cul-de-sac in the aptly named community Pleasant Grove.
Oh, this is a new beginning for me. And this is what I've really been dreaming of for my kids, you know.
I think people have made a lot of money from keeping an underclass in New Orleans. And now, those people who were in that underclass are now in Atlanta and Houston and Dallas and starting to say, I got better opportunities here, and the schools are a lot better here.
My sister Catherine is relocated to Houston, Texas. It's Catherine, my mother, and my nephew Nicholas. Nicholas is 9 years old, he's autistic, nonverbal. So they can't stay here because there's no hospitals in the local New Orleans East area. He's absolutely doing wonderful out there with the schooling. He's getting close to starting to actually say words now, like mama or whatever. But when I talk to her every day, because I talk to her and my mom every single day, 7 days a week, at least 5 to 10 times a day. You can hear the want, they want to come back, but there's nothing to help them to survive here. So my family is in Texas.
And I'm not sure where New Orleans is going to go from here. You know, it was bad. We're starting at -12, and I don't know how we're going to get to 3. You know, I really don't know what's going to happen. I honestly think that I'm hoping that people who had the mind to work and were trying to just give themselves a better opportunity and a better situation in life, I hope that they don't come back.
My Uncle James is still in Utah. He said they're giving him everything, free rent, an apartment, a new TV.
My roots are tied firmly into this place. My parents and grandparents are buried here. So this is really my home. But it's hard to stay in a place that you feel that don't really want you to be in.
I don't want to even be under their jurisdiction. I don't want to be under the, the leadership. No one in New Orleans or Louisiana, no.
I don't think I'll ever come back. There's nothing here for me.
They don't care about us here, so, I got to do the next best thing for me and my family, which is move on.
If they wanted us in New Orleans, they wouldn't have tried to drown us and kill us. So I'm not going back so they can finish it off.
Post-Katrina, I think we're doing a horrible job with respect to getting people home. It's very attractive for them to stay in those places like Houston and Atlanta and Memphis. But there comes a time when folks were like, well, wait a minute, we were just doing this out of the goodness of our hearts as Americans who care about Americans. When are you going to take care of your people? And what do you do in Louisiana, New Orleans, to bring your people home?
People have been dispersed to 44 different states around the United States with one-way tickets. There's no clear discussion and debate other than myself having with Washington about how we get folk back.
The question I've asked FEMA over and over again, my husband has asked FEMA over and over again, why don't you give them a ticket back home? It could be a voucher. You know, they can't cash it for anything else, but at least give them the option of coming back.
Pre-Katrina, the murder rate is approaching 200, and African-American males killing each other over this city day in and day out. 4 or 5 people getting killed sometime a night in the same house. The school system was one of the worst in the nation. Our poverty rate was double that of every major city in the country. The wages for the common man was below the national average. The wages for professionals was even below national average.
New Orleans is different only in that 67 to 70% of people there are African Americans, and that a very large proportion of African Americans are living in a situation which violates, in my terms, really violates human rights in a wealthy country like the United States.
A lot of people are speculating about the crime returning in New Orleans. And I don't think that there's more crime, and people are pointing towards the proportion of the population. But what we're seeing is it's about the same as it was. I think some people had that brief 2-3 weeks where it was calm, and they figured, the trash is out of the city. The storm came and swept the trash out of the city. But what they failed to realize, I'm trying to figure out, why they ever imagined this new New Orleans.
Early Saturday, 5 teens were murdered in a storm of automatic weapons fire on a city street just blocks from the central business district. Among the dead, Mona Lisa Hunter's 2 sons.
I don't care what they say, drugs, retaliation. They didn't deserve this.
We've had enough. So today, an angry mayor of New Orleans asked for and got several hundred National Guard soldiers and additional state police officers to try and stem the rising tide of violence.
This is our line in the sand. We are saying we're not going any further.
In a city still pleading for residents to come home, the sell gets tougher when crime seems to be returning faster than people.
The African-American crime on African-Americans, particularly young black men, is a direct result of the educational system, in my opinion. If you don't give young brothers the opportunity to better themselves individually and then also tend to their families, then it's going to continue to be a vicious cycle.
This educational system is just killing the city. Young brothers were dropping out at the ages of 14, 15, and 16 at a very early age. They were just checking out, and then they would get into, the activity that we all wish they never would.
Breaking news, the National Guard is called into New Orleans, no, not because of Katrina, not because of national disaster, because of the crime rate. It's hard for me to imagine, after everyone surviving Katrina, now this...
How many of you have actually seen this film in its entirety? As you know, it's 4 hours, and so it's difficult to get a 10-minute clip that captures all of the many things that are going on here. But I think what this does provide is a sense of Spike Lee's basic approach, which was an approach of interviewing scores and scores of residents of New Orleans and others around the country to try to make some sense of what this was all about. Although I think we would also all have to readily admit that it's difficult to make sense of what is essentially something that's incomprehensible, I think, in a country such as ours. To begin, the PowerPoint though, I thought that what I would put up were a series of quotations that would give us a sense of reaction to the Hurricane Katrina event. One of the things we tried to do in this curriculum was to get at the multiple perspectives that surrounded the catastrophe. And it really became very clear to us as we put the curriculum together, the very polarized set of views that we found in this country. So just a set of them here from a variety of people, not taken to be representative, but just really getting at the different points of view about what went on. Yeah. This, of course, although the quote was given as part of an NPR broadcast in 2006, Pastor John Hagee, as you may remember, this statement surfaced recently because he's endorsed John McCain. It's hard not to editorialize here, but I'm going to try to exhibit some discipline. And this one, of course, that we just saw. And now a word from our sponsors. We were fortunate in being able to do this curriculum project because of the generosity of the Rockefeller Foundation, and it was a collaboration. One of the challenges for us in putting it together was the request on the part of the Rockefeller Foundation, who gave us funds in the fall of 2005 and wanted the curriculum prepared for, in the fall of 2006 and wanted the curriculum prepared for the second anniversary of Katrina. So it was very much a collaborative enterprise with all of these players and working very heated pace in order to make this all happen. So let me tell you a little bit more specifically about the origins of the project. I think all of us remember vividly the footage from Hurricane Katrina and the subsequent breach of the levees, this almost a simultaneous occurrence. And it was, you need to remind some younger students, for example, who I've spoken to over the past year, that it really was the breach of the levees rather than the hurricane. Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans at a Category 3 level, not the Category 5 level that was first predicted. But virtually simultaneously, the levees started to breach and the city filled up very rapidly, to the point that about 80% of the city, which is essentially a bowl which sits below sea level, 80% of the city was filled with water. At the time of the disaster, Spike Lee was at the Venice Film Festival watching the footage of what was occurring there on a variety of stations. His 4-hour documentary also includes, I should point out, a director's commentary, which can get a little slow at times, but also provides some very interesting insights into his making of the story. But right from the outset, he understood that this was an epic story, and that he vowed, as he tells it, to go home and get in touch with HBO in order to make the documentary. When HBO aired the documentary in August of '06 at the 1-year anniversary of Katrina, they got calls from college professors, high school teachers, community groups asking for curriculum. And HBO hadn't thought about curriculum. So they got in touch with the Rockefeller Foundation, which had begun a massive effort in New Orleans of all sorts of work to try to repair the city. And they got in touch with Rockefeller that had actually contributed a little bit of money to the creation of Spike Lee's documentary, when the documentary went from 2 hours, which it was its original scope, to 4 hours. And so they went to Rockefeller, and then Rockefeller got in touch with us in order to create the curriculum. it was very clear from the outset of this project, and happily the Rockefeller Foundation, HBO, and Teachers College were all in agreement that race and class had to be the centerpieces of this curriculum. In the education business, of course, we talk about race and class as the evaded curriculum. These are topics that are somewhat taboo, sadly, in high school classes and elementary school classes, and probably in many college classes as well. So we wanted to put race and class out there centrally, but we also wanted to do it in a way that encouraged honest dialogues, recognizing all of the perspectives about the events of Katrina, and certainly all of the perspectives in this very complicated society that we live in on issues such as race and class. We wanted there to be an open-ended quality to the dialogues, but we didn't want the dialogues just to be about talk, or talk to be the end game here. I think, as Dean Wasley points out, you watch this film, you look at the curriculum, you immerse yourself into anything that's been written, the volumes that have been written about the event, and it can be a very, very depressing experience. And we felt kind of an educational mandate to ensure that it wasn't just dialogue that would come out of engagement with these issues, but some type of civic response. And so throughout the curriculum, we embedded a taking action segment that invites individuals to do something as a result of the dialogue. Our strategy also in that regard was because we really see this as a shared American experience. Yes, it happened in the Gulf Coast region. Of course, those of us in New York had had the experience several years earlier of 9/11. Every region can point to the disasters, the vulnerabilities that it faces, and that was part of what we wanted to accomplish with this curriculum as well, to have people who used it understand that this was about our citizenship, essentially. So we designed the curriculum for a variety of different audiences. We also, I should point out, started with an essay on the history of New Orleans. Probably many of you have been there as tourists or as convention goers. It's a favorite place for conferences. It's probably not a place that many of us have studied as part of our formal curriculum, and yet it has a really interesting history. It's a history of the French and of the Spanish and of the English, of course, as latecomers, of Native Americans, of African Americans as a slave entrepot. It is an incredibly multicultural curriculum that certainly is quite distinct, or multicultural history that's quite distinct from the story that we tell in our textbooks of the Puritans and the Pilgrims. So we felt it was important to establish that historical context at the outset of the curriculum, and then to put front and center a set of lessons about media literacy. We felt it was important, much as all of us are awestruck by the artistry, the accomplishment of Spike Lee. It is a masterful achievement, this film, and it has won numerous awards from around the country and around the world. So we don't want to take anything away from that achievement. Nevertheless, we do want to be sure that people who use this curriculum recognize that we're not accepting uncritically Spike Lee's point of view on these events, that his is one very informed point of view, to be sure, but there are other points of view as well. And so we put a media literacy set of lessons right up front so that the students, especially who look at this documentary, have the same set of critical thinking skills that they might bring to other types of texts. And again, due to the generosity of the Rockefeller Foundation, we were able to send 30,000 copies of the DVD and the curriculum to recipients across the country. The two central questions that we used as sort of the overarching motifs for the curriculum were, what kind of country are we, and what kind of country do we want to be? And we use Hurricane Katrina as a case study, if you will, for an analysis of a set of questions around race and class, and an understanding of why this catastrophe hit poor people so hard. And a question that probably you heard at the time, which was, why didn't people just get out of town? And I like to tell audiences that I speak to that we had a number of historians from Tulane University on our advisory board. They didn't leave town either. So it wasn't just the poor who didn't leave town, often not leaving town because they didn't have a car or funds because it was the end of the month, or a place to go, or a credit card to book a hotel room. But it was people such as Tulane University professors who were differently situated on all of those different factors typically, and also didn't leave. But we wanted people, as I said before, also to understand that this is something that we are all implicated in. This is our democracy. At some level, we all have to ask the question, what can we do as citizens to ensure that we don't have a governmental failure again like that that occurred in New Orleans? And how can we use this episode to encourage people to talk about the evaded curriculum and to get involved in their communities so that individuals know the kinds of vulnerabilities, the risks that we all face? One of our advisory board members was Greg Thomas, who is a disaster and emergency preparedness expert. And Greg came in to talk to the team of curriculum writers early on. He wrote a book called Freedom from Fear in the Aftermath of 9/11. And Greg's point of view on this is that, yes, while we should all be pushing government at all levels to claim some responsibility for protecting us, in the end, we'd be foolish and naive to put too much of our faith in government. That all of us as family members, as individuals, need to know what to do in the face of catastrophe, because ultimately Greg's point of view is that government will disappoint. I just put this up to remind us all of what this cataclysmic event meant for the city. Have any of you been back or been to New Orleans since the flood? Maybe your reaction is like mine. I've been back several times. While the water is not there, things haven't progressed very far. It's really striking, I think, how little progress has been made. This is a graphic done by a geographer at Tulane, Richard Campanella, that shows some of the places that were hardest hit. I think we've all heard about the lower Ninth Ward here, and St. Bernard's Parish and New Orleans East up there. Perhaps not so familiar Lakeview up north there by Lake Pontchartrain is actually quite an affluent community that also was extremely hard hit because of water coming from the lake. The other place I'd point out here is the Gretna Bridge, the notorious Gretna Bridge, where residents from New Orleans were trying to flee the city and were stopped by the police force in Gretna, which is, Gretna is largely a white community, and with rifles the police said, turn around and go back, we're not going to let you over this bridge to high land. So one of the more notorious incidents, certainly of this, in terms of response by the community. Here we see a levee, and when I talk to student groups who aren't familiar with levees, I just like to show what a levee looks like, and especially a levee that doesn't work, as these unfortunately did not. Here we have a distribution of the curriculum. As you can see, we've managed to hit all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and up into British Columbia. Let me just turn now for a couple of minutes in kind of wrapping this up to why I think those of us who wrote the curriculum agree with Wynton Marsalis that this was a signature moment. What I try to do in talking to audiences, again, is to say, okay, how are we all implicated in this? Or how should we all think about Hurricane Katrina so that we are really aware of the degree of vulnerability that all of us have? So I like to call Hurricane Katrina a critical lesson, borrowing from Nell Noddings, and suggesting that one of the ways in which Hurricane Katrina is a critical lesson for us all is again, this notion of shared vulnerability, if for no other reason that levees aren't unique to the New Orleans area. About a year after Katrina and the breach of the levees, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers admitted that there were over 120 levees across the country that were highly vulnerable. The largest number of these are in California, and I think we saw just last fall the breach of levees in Nevada, for example, places where I think many of us wouldn't actually consider that there would be a levee system. So we've got an infrastructure that is problematic across the country. We've got problems of race and poverty that for many people, puzzlement, I think, to some of us, but Katrina was really a wake-up call. I'm sure you heard people say, I can't believe, Americans say, I can't believe that what I'm watching was occurring here in the United States. Now, you know, that doesn't come as a surprise to a lot of us, but Spike Lee said that when he was in Europe, this was a refrain that he heard again and again and again, and I think many of us recognize that this is part of the American story that is not as widely known and acknowledged as should be. The Journal of American History late last year did a really wonderful issue on Katrina, and the question was asked in a variety of ways as to what Katrina means for our consideration of ourselves as a nation. And this, I think, is a nice, succinct statement of something that I'm sure we're going to be talking about in just a moment. From the standpoint of a kind of an environmental approach on this, again, one can't simply put New Orleans at a distance and say it was poorly managed. The government at all levels was not up to speed on these things. We've got problems across this country, as I'm sure many of you know, as a result of global warming. Certainly those of us on the East Coast, in New Orleans, in Miami, in New York, are highly vulnerable to the effects of severe storm. And I'd like to make a pitch for this book because I think Tidwell's a journalist who tells the story in such a way as to, let's just say it doesn't make for good bedtime reading if you're trying to fall asleep and live anywhere near a coastal area. But it's a great representation, I think, of the problems that we're all going to face, not in too distant future. And I know in New York, for example, very little has been done about this. Perhaps Seattle is ahead, but they've just established in the last year a mayor's commission on the problems of global warming and all of the flooding that's going to occur in the islands in New York City and into New Jersey and into Connecticut. So some of the questions that are asked by the curriculum, as I said before, this is an inquiry-oriented curriculum. We pose questions. We don't provide answers. This is fundamentally because a lot of the answers that you would bring to these questions are ones that are rooted fundamentally in values and philosophy. And people need to deliberate them. People need to come to some common understanding about these things based on their perspectives. This, of course, ties us into the longer history that the Journal of American History was pointing out, that in 1968, the Kerner Commission asked the question, are there two Americas? And I think we need to revisit this issue today. But our basic strategy was this, that we would show a clip or encourage teachers to show a clip from the film, then to pose a question such as this one, can the Gretna Bridge be seen as a symbolic dividing line between the two Americas, or is this an oversimplification of highly complex events? What was going on with Gretna is the question we want to ask and get students talking about. Then we provide them with a variety of online sources, some of which we were able to use and actually put as excerpts into the curriculum, primary sources for students to investigate and then try to analyze and make meaning out of. And then let me see if I can get this up. Oh, maybe not. Let me just point out the website then, that Teaching the Levees, www.teachingthelevees.org, has just launched its third phase of its professional development website. Professor Banks actually is very prominently featured in the opening frame of the website, and some remarks that he gave at Brooklyn College for us last fall are an integral part of this website. But the effort here is to offer teachers some resources that would be helpful, some models and examples of places that the curriculum has been taught around the country. So when thinking of wrapping this up, I think the question really is whether, as educators, we can muster the conviction and the energy to bring these topics to the schools, the colleges in which we teach, and as citizens, whether we can follow the advice recently given by Barack Obama that we need to talk about these issues in the town square, in our communities, in our families. So let me just conclude by saying a big thank you to Professor James Banks and Cherry Banks, to Walter, Michael Honey, and Joy Williamson, everybody who's made this possible. Dennis, Scott, thank you all very much. And thank you for coming, because I think the one thing, when I've spoken to audiences in New Orleans about this topic, they've said again and again, it's so good to hear that people from other parts of the country haven't forgotten about us. That, I think, is their greatest fear, that the rest of the country really is not concerned anymore. I'd like to tell them that we are definitely concerned. So thank you all very much.
We'll do this section for about a half hour, and then leave plenty of time for Q&A with the panelists, plus your comments and questions and wonderings about this sort of amazing event, and then the curriculum that's been developed to teach this event as a text, if you will. I'm always impressed. Well, I'm impressed with who's in the audience. Let me say that. But in particular, I noticed Catherine came in from Cleveland High School, and one of my student teachers who's working with Catherine Brown there reminded our teacher ed students that films can be taught as texts. And just as a function of being with Catherine for just like a minute or maybe a week, Nicole had already adapted the vocabulary of talking about films as texts, and which films made particular texts, and the concept of teaching a film as a text, much like you would teach The Old Man and the Sea as a text, and which is probably the more conventional understanding of that. So we had a brief conversation before, also with some teachers from University Prep, who I'm glad are here. We have about, oh yes, it's very possible to teach films as texts, and it's immediately the concept sort of raises the bar on what it means to teach a film in the classroom rather than merely showing a film. So by way of acknowledging the audience, I just want to say how thrilled I am the variety of kind of demographics, if you will, who are here today. We have our most honored guests, of course, are school teachers who somehow got subs and whatnot to be here this morning, and there's a good number of you, and thank you for working that out and figuring that one out. And there's district personnel as well from a number of districts here, and there are faculty from other universities, and there are community members. And what are some of the other sort of, if you will, demographics? Graduate students from the University of Washington and elsewhere. We have student teachers who somehow are not in your field placement this morning and figured that out. Congratulations. And students from other universities here as well. Faculty from other universities, I mentioned. We have both Bothell and Tacoma and Lehman College in the Bronx here. And other categories of... Social services. Thank you. Well put. Community and national organizations. But you're working in Marysville. Mm-hmm. Got it. Got it. And, you know, what category would sort of capture you that hasn't been Say that again? Citizens, that's good. That's great. Then we could broaden that out to persons, and and humanity itself is represented here. That's good. Citizen is an important category. Thank you very much. Denizens as well. That would those who live here but may not necessarily be citizens. So it's really terrific that we've joined together for this work. We have a lot going on campus. Paul Willis, the author of Learning to Labor, is on campus now. And David Harvey, the geographer at New York University, whose book, The Short History of Neoliberalism, is a terrific introduction to the current political economy. Jean Lave, the anthropologist at Berkeley, is here. There's a certain foment right now, and they were saying last night that they think there's sort of an opportunity right now. It was very hopeful that there's a bit of an opportunity right now across the land, and maybe in the education sector in particular, for change, for teaching as a subversive activity, if you will. The old book that I hope you have in your professional libraries, and I'm sure you can still get it at good used bookstores around town. So the panelists are certainly working today well below their pay grade, and we thank them for that. I thought we might open with a question that is quite similar to the one Margaret was posing near the end, and Margaret is a member of the panel as well, so you're please participate as such. I warmly invite you to. What does Katrina? Let's start broad. What does Katrina mean for America? Please.
Oh, you want us to use these?
Or table mics, yes.
Table mics.
Thank you.
I think that's the main thing I want to say something about. So if I talk a little bit long, maybe I won't talk as much in the other parts of it.
I'll be free to shake the rattle too.
Yeah, give me a. I've been traveling around the country a lot in the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks. It was the 40-year anniversary of Dr. King's death, April 4th, and it caused people like Katrina to think about history and to look back and to look at the present in a critical way. And so the audiences that I've been talking with, from New York City to Washington, D.C., to Memphis, to Anchorage, Alaska, Tacoma, Portland, San Francisco, I noticed that there's a sort of a unanimous, almost, sentiment about the current situation, which speaks directly to these issues that were just raised about what does this event mean? What does the Katrina event mean? In similar ways, people are looking at 40 years since King, and what does this tell us? Gore Vidal says we're the United States of amnesia. And I think, from a teaching perspective, I think the point I'd like to make for us is that we're in a very good moment, or a very bad moment, however you want to say it, to teach about these issues of race, class, gender, poverty, the global economy. I'm working right now with the Labor and Working Class History Association. I'm the president of it. There's some pamphlets on the back. We're having a big conference in Vancouver in June 6th, Immigrant, Migrant, Labor, and Globalization, where we're talking about different communities from all over the globe, but particularly in the Pacific Northwest, who are impacted by what's going on with labor and immigration and race and gender. And I think the pictures that we just saw and the discussion we just heard really should cause us to think about these things in a framework that a lot of times they're not put in. It's not just race, class, and gender. It's put it a little slightly different, is labor. That New Orleans is one of the cities where labor unions have been ultimately almost completely destroyed. It's one of the states, Louisiana is one of the so-called right-to-work states. Martin Luther King said, don't be fooled, right to work doesn't give you any rights and it doesn't give you any work. and we call it right to work for less. And you remember that when George Bush first started the Reconstruction efforts, they voided all the Davis-Bacon rules that would put not even union wages, but just standard wages for the local area, that those would be in all the contracts. They wanted to go below that. And from day one, when Bush came into office, his whole objective has been to get rid of all labor standards. I was shocked. The first mailing I ever got from George Bush when he was first running for office. I mean, a lot of us knew that he was a knave, you know, from the very beginning. He wanted to get rid of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. That's minimum wages, minimum hour or maximum hours, working conditions, things that govern, you know, the workplace. He wanted to get rid of that. They've basically gotten rid of the Wagner Act, the right to organize. As a worker, you don't have a right to organize anymore, really, in reality. And you could see in the aftermath of Katrina that they're going in there with the idea of low-wage workers. Why do we have a big immigration issue? They wanted to bring in immigrant workers to take those jobs. So they didn't talk about bringing back the people who fled or left New Orleans and creating a job base for them. That's one of the reasons they can't come back. There is no job base for them. It's all based on what we call a neoliberal global capitalist model, which is, we also call it the race to the bottom. Lowest wages, bad working conditions, get the most profit out of the workers possible. And of course, we know what that paradigm leads to. Right now, it's led to a destroyed American economy, you know, where on the one hand, corporate people are making not millions, but billions of dollars in a given year, while the workers their wages are stagnating, and the middle class is really in bad shape, and the lower class is in absolute desperation. And so what we saw in Katrina was just that all came to life in front of our very eyes. You know, the United States as Haiti, the United States as any third world country where living conditions and wages have been driven down to the absolute bottom. And that's really the dilemma of people in New Orleans. And so I think we should, in teaching about it, we should look at all these aspects and ramifications and the role of the federal government, which was despicable, you know, where they knew these things could happen. After it happened, George Bush said, well, who could have ever thought that this would happen? Well, everybody had been saying this was going to happen. And then putting political appointees and head of FEMA, destroying really the infrastructure for dealing with these things. So there's so many different issues here to talk about what is the problem with the government in the United States? Why is it so non-functional? It's done on purpose. But a central point in that whole thing is about labor. And when you talk about labor, you're also talking about race and gender.
Okay,
you know?
Let's take it there. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So that's firmly placing labor on the table. Joy Williamson.
Yes.
Would you chime in on this?
Well, I was going to, since, like he said, I have more to say about questions later, so I was going to reserve my comments until then.
That's good. Good.
But one thing that I would add is I think that it is a pregnant moment for conversation. So I'm approaching me. And that I think that Katrina, the aftermath of it, what is meant for Americans, maybe not America, is I think some people got the message, you have to look out for number one, the government doesn't care about you. And they've been completely demoralized and have become very individual in the way that they think about themselves. I mean, I think the community now is really your immediate family, the way that people are defining community. But I also believe that there are other things that can be gotten, and that's what I believe is in the curriculum, whether it's, some people consider it perhaps a call to a vocation. You know, so you see what was happening, well, maybe I'll run for public office. You know, so there are other things that can come out of the experience for Americans, but I do believe that it has left a possibly very dangerous legacy in the way that we conceive of community.
Thanks, Joy. Margaret, do you want to chime in on this one?
Just briefly to raise the issue, since so many of us in the room are educators of one sort or another, of the really very poor educational system that existed in New Orleans and in Louisiana generally and in Mississippi. And I think it is very much kind of what Michael was talking about in terms of the privatization of different aspects of our lives as citizens. The kind of rebirth now of charter schools is for some a kind of a good news story, because it does seem that there are some good things happening in education, but at what cost? I mean, the kind of the unwillingness of the citizens of that city and state to provide adequate education is, of course, directly linked to the problems of especially young African American males and high dropout rates, crime, violence. I mean, all of these things are very much a tangled web, and I think the fundamental issues of educational equity in this country, one in which those of us whose kids may be in good schools really may not care as much as we should about the education that exists in inner cities such as New York City or New Orleans and other places. So I just want to put that on the table, because I think education is centrally implicated in this situation.
What about the local? So it's pretty obvious that what this means for people living in New Orleans. What does it mean for people living in Seattle or Denver or New York? How is this a local issue?
I'm ready. I think it's actually a parallel to what Margaret had said about the levees, and that there are levees all over the United States that are failing. Well, there are educational systems and districts all over the United States that are failing, and so it's important to recognize that what happened in New Orleans, it's important for people in Seattle and Denver and other places to realize that what happened in New Orleans was not an anomaly, that it is happening in our own backyards, as people say. And I think it's really a deliberate naivete. It's feigning ignorance. You really don't have to go very far to see horrible schooling conditions and living conditions, but we choose to ignore them because that makes us uncomfortable. So I do believe that one, understanding that it's not that New Orleans was not an anomaly, but also it kind of gets back to what I was saying about community. I think if we look at New Orleans as this isolated place where these refugees came from, then we don't see our lives as bound up with theirs. Now there's the book Talking to Strangers. Danielle Allen has kind of come at the University of Washington, at least in the College of Ed. It's like an organic common book that people have been reading, and she talks about the fact that in this society, it necessitates sacrifice and loss. Somebody has to sacrifice and lose for us to work, to be able to, for all of us to thrive, for the society to continue to move forward. So how do we actually attend to that sacrifice and loss? And I think that is something that those of us in other places outside of New Orleans need to think about. So our successes are hinging on other people's sacrifices. And so if that's necessary, how do we as a society actually attend to that loss and make sure that those people don't actually feel it in health care and education in these very serious ways that impact life chances?
Anyone?
I think the way what it means for people in various places is that, that we can draw on this situation that happened there and not transpose it, but raise issues that relate to all of us here. And they definitely do. Last night we had a big day of strikes and immigrant rallies for immigrant rights, and one of the interesting things that happened was the ILWU, the West Coast Labor Union, 25,000 workers went on strike. Or it wasn't a strike really, it was a walkout. They didn't go to work against the war. And so we had a rally down in Tacoma, and we were talking about all of these issues, and immediately everything we're talking about here came up. So it wasn't really just about Iraq. It was about all the things that Iraq symbolizes. And this is true in every community in the United States, I would venture. And one of the things is the cost. The Nation did a great article, a series of articles recently. They found that in Memphis, Tennessee, where I've done a lot of my research, and the Going Down Jericho Road book takes place in Memphis, and the strike and all of the meanings of that strike and King's death there. They've been taxed $800,000 They've paid $800,000 in taxes to support the Iraq War. Memphis is not very different from New Orleans, and I wonder what they paid in New Orleans. The school system is failing in Memphis. They translated this: for that much money, they could build 36 brand new schools in Memphis. They could virtually redo the whole school system. And so this, the war and the priorities, upside down priorities of the country are killing us. But it's when these moments come where you can see that it's killing us. That's the teachable thing, and it relates to every city and every place in America.
Just say real quickly, I think we have to ask ourselves a question about this when we consider what this means for us. Going back to that issue of why were people so surprised by what they saw in New Orleans? Often, we know what we don't know, but oftentimes we don't even know what we don't know. And I think this was an instance of that, where people around the country, and it may say something about where we are in terms of our lives and our communities, the ability to insulate oneself from the realities of this society is frightening to me. And especially when you look at what's going on with the media, the consolidation of the media, the ownership of the media, the kind of anesthetizing that I think the media provides by putting such an emphasis on the lifestyles of the rich and famous, the Hollywood types. To me, this is really frightening, because it takes from us the very tools that we need as citizens to critique our situation, whether it is local or further afield, and thus to make some kind of judgment about what we need in government to attend to the needs I think that we all have, no matter where we live.
One more thing, Walter. So I think it's also, people might not know. Actually, I'm not convinced. I think people choose not to know. Also, it's the way people choose to explain once they do find out. That's the second tier of the issue that really galls me. And so now you know, but the way that you go about explaining the condition, how it exists, why it is maintained, is kind of the second step in that process.
Okay, so don't forget your questions. I'm going to ask another one, but jot yours down so that as another topic is brought up, you don't lose a question that you wanted to ask yourself. So we have this theme of Katrina made visible something. Katrina helped, Katrina shone a light on an array of phenomena, and then once the light is shown, what do you do with it? How do you explain that, and what are the alternative explanations that are available for a phenomena like Katrina? Let me kind of push in that direction a little bit. So if we put the idea of the political economy on the table, or what Americans typically call economics, or the economy, but political system and the economic system in another way are the same system. So the term political economy helps to put them together into this and name them as one idea. So when we put the political economy on the table, and maybe as well citizenship, one thing we've seen is thousands of volunteers have gone to New Orleans from high schools and colleges and churches and temples and communities. Been a lot of volunteers going there. So how are we to read that? It's certainly it's civic engagement, and that is to be honored, respected, and appreciated. But what if we, how do we weigh that against government responsibility and corporate responsibility, the responsibility of the business roundtables and the organizations of corporations? So the political economy, civic engagement, government responsibility, corporate responsibility, how should we read, to narrow it down, how should we read thousands of people going to New Orleans to volunteer? Sounds great. Is it?
I would just point out, and I'm no great defender of Walmart, but actually Walmart did pretty well in this set of circumstances and coming in and bringing lots of water, lots of needed resources far in advance of what the federal government did. So it's hard to talk about this because we can paint with a very, very broad brush. But business aside, the issue really of individuals. You saw Cynthia Hedge-Morell, for example, as one of the individuals on this clip, a city councilwoman in New Orleans. She was part of the launch of the levees that we did at Teachers College last September. And she made a very strong case for how affirmed the people of New Orleans felt by the hundreds and thousands of individuals who've come down to that region to help rebuild. She said it was not just what people did, because often it was kind of mucking out of the mud from in a house or in a school, work that was very, very slow going, but it was more the symbol of people being there as a form of solidarity, rather so much than what they actually accomplished. And I think that there's a long tradition of this. I mean, you go back to Alexis de Tocqueville writing in the 18th century about this country, and he talks about voluntary associations and the willingness of Americans to pitch in. If there's any kind of good story about what happened with Katrina, I think this is the good story of college students, high school students who've gone down there, church groups, community groups, who've really tried to help out. Although at this point, many of them are leaving and there's still very, very much to be done. But I think that I would make something positive of that. And I know from the people at LSU and Tulane and Southern who I've spoken with, the people in Common Ground down there, there really is a sense that this has been very helpful to the healing process, even if you can't necessarily point to so many houses built or so many schools cleaned up.
Yeah.
I completely agree that this kind of generosity and compassion should be construed as a good thing. It should be. And this is when I was reading this book, the children Katrina left behind. And it's actually what I think that was Michael Eric Dyson he said there's a difference between charity and justice. And so what these individuals bring is charity. But what the people of New Orleans need and these other kids in these underserved communities need is justice. And so in this book, I forget which author, she tells this story. She says there's this man, an older man on a beach. He lives on the beach. He sits there every day, and every day a young boy comes by and picks up these starfish and gently tosses the starfish back into the ocean. And the man asks him, and he sees this boy do it every day because the starfish keep washing up. And this man asked this young boy, so why are you doing this? He said, well, I'm trying to save these starfish. And he's trying to do it one by one. He said, well, you have to come back here every day. Might there be something else? He said, well, at this point, this is what I can manage one by one. And so she uses, I believe it's a woman, I think it's Jackie Jordan Irvine, says that this is actually how teachers see themselves. They're starfish throwers. But what really needs to happen is that young boy and that man need to talk about how can we stop these starfish from washing up on this beach so we don't have to just toss one by one each day. And so we might get to this later, but I think what Katrina offers and what the curriculum offers is really a challenge to teacher education programs to help these future teachers think much more deliberately about their role in not just the classroom, but in society.
For the lovely symmetry of it, let's jump to the audience for a question. Nancy Beatty, Professor.
I just wanted to build on the question you asked and just pose it as a question of how we turn that social capital that was demonstrated in that voluntary effort into political capital. So that's just a way of framing it, and I don't know if anybody has any thoughts in that direction. I mean, so is that a potential political capital that, now everybody goes home and it dissipates, or is there an opportunity there to turn that into the kind of political coalition building that would be necessary to change things at a broader level?
But is it possible to transform that social capital into a political capital?
I don't know if any of this is happening we have a staff worker in our campus who's gone down 4 times to New Orleans to help with whatever, and saving animals, saving lives, whatever. And it's incredibly politicized her. In fact, she's mad as hell. After seeing this, she's just so angry. And so I've been trying to think with her, how can I get her to use that anger in Tacoma to help us build a movement around different issues. I don't know if there's any way. I know that the group led by Eric Mann in Los Angeles, I forget what it's called, the Center for Renewal or something. They're very class, race, gender oriented, and they've been on the Katrina issue from the very beginning, and they worked with a group of people in New Orleans who were former SNCC organizers. And they were presenting a certain narrative. You probably ran up into these people, sometimes good, sometimes not. They wanted to politicize it very much, and that's what Eric Mann's group does. And they're trying to put it in the context of the second Reconstruction of the Civil Rights Movement and going back to the first Reconstruction and poverty in the South and what does it mean and why is it like that. And then, in the end, to frame it in social movement terms, that, again, that charity is fine, but justice is what we want, and to build movements sort of around the sensibilities that have been aroused by the Katrina thing. And so I think that probably plays out differently in every community, and but I think it's really important to plug people in some way to social movement politics who've been affected by this.
But I just wanted to know what I get when I'm running around talking about these issues, and I just want to throw it to the panel and the audience, is how can I put in Professor Krako's wonderful curriculum, because I have to prepare for the Wasley. I get that question, and I just wanted all of us to talk about it. I have my answer, but I want you to.
Why don't you take the first shot at that question? You, yes, please. Thank you.
I thank you so much, Joy, for saying what you said, because I'm a longtime educator in the district and now working with teachers. And to a teacher, what they tell us, I don't care where they're coming from to us, they say, we were never prepared for this. This meaning working in the very multicultural schools that we have. Some of them are not diverse at all because they are all one ethnicity. And people call them diverse, but that's not diverse. They're segregated. But they say, we were not prepared for this. So districts spend hundreds and thousands of dollars re-educating teachers in how to work. So I am so glad you are here. And I know that Dean Wasley, I'm so glad she is here because there are changes that are being made in the education program here at the university. But I think it's, when do they have to talk about this? As a person of color, to be able to walk in the world of white, I need to know all about the world of white to be successful. I also need to know about my other brothers and sisters of color to be able to interact with them. But as a white person, you don't have to really know anything about me to be successful. Because there's always going to, and the you is the greater you, of course, because there's always going to be, well, you know, they come from here, well, you know, education is important. There's always going to be ways that we write that off. So in addition to the very solid reasons you gave, it's just they've never had, majority has never had to look at that. So the awareness that we walk around with all the time is not present. So it's that awareness.
Thank you very much. Over to Christina, please.
Yeah. Well, and to piggyback on that,
louder if you please.
To piggyback on that, working in a school that's predominantly white and upper class, I'm surrounded by teachers who are raising social justice issues, but I'm feeling a lot of fatigue from the students because they live in a bubble of privilege. They hear about global warming, they hear about Katrina, they hear about tuberculosis and AIDS. They're hearing about social justice in the media and democracy, and these things are touched on, but they're feeling, I think, a lot of guilt and pushback in terms of what can I do about this. Now I'm sitting in a classroom, and I have to go to second period and third period, and I've got a ton of homework. And so I'm also working maybe on the other end of the educational spectrum where kids are pushing back when we do raise these issues. And so, and we get to those issues, I think, in some complexity, but how to add the piece of action or what they can do.
And not to sell short the difficulty of the first part of that, dealing with the topics in some degree of complexity, right? That's a huge problem. You remember Margaret's first response to the curriculum question was to raise the question, or we've named specific concepts here, right? Raise the concept, teach the concept. What is race? What is class? What is labor? What is social justice? Remember when His Holiness the Dalai Lama was in town? He just kept, which had happened recently for us. In each of the forums at Key Arena, for example, where there were thousands of school children present, kept urging adults to actually raise the concept of compassion. Just nothing too romantic around it, nothing too hairy-fairy around it. Something like, what is that? He's a science geek, after all. So, like, what precisely is that thing called compassion? Is it the same as empathy? Is it learned? Is it inborn? So there's some complexity to each of these concepts, probably especially the concepts where we already know the vocabulary. We know the word race, we know the word class, we know the word labor, we know the words two-word concept label social justice, we know the word compassion, we know the word empathy. Those are particularly difficult because it's easy to mistake knowledge of the word for knowledge of the concept. That's what Hilda Taba called the rattle of an empty wagon, is the use of a term as though you had explored its meaning. So there's a tremendous need for work around the concepts themselves and the complexity of the issues, the needed depth of whites walking in a world of color, people of color walking in a world of white. That's tremendously rich. Thank you. Your questions now. What else, please, Dennis?
I'd like to actually propose a particular challenge.
Maybe stand and turn around.
Sure. Being that we have folks here from the College of Education, school folks in the public schools, folks of nonprofits and such, it's recently become more public attention, to everyone's public attention, that the Office of Race and Equity Relations for Seattle Public Schools will be canceled. Has been canceled. The director, Caprice Hollins, was basically, and this is my interpretation of it, was basically Palestine and the Middle East peace process. Because at the table there was no conversation. There was no, well, we're going to replace it with this, and so here's how, right? There was none of that. They fired a staff person, so this issue of being deliberate was definitely at play here, right? Now, whether this program gets replaced with something else or what have you, I think this is a really pivotal moment where we can say, no, we need to talk about this stuff, and we need to have some structures in place to continue to face and challenge these issues and do something about that. So I wonder what suggestions we have, and beyond just talking about it, can we collaborate beyond our particular bubbles and work collaboratively to say, no, we need to. This has to be integral to what we are about and what we're doing as educators.
Please.
Yeah, I hope in the curriculum that there's a space provided where you're teaching kids how to talk to those in power, and because it's pretty scary to try and take on some of these issues, but as a person of color, I know that I've had to work through issues like that, and so how to start a conversation with those that are different from you, I hope that's in the curriculum, but also like how to start a conversation with those that are different from you and have power. And I feel like that's just essential, and it's an essential question in how to become a good citizen. Because I mean, I really didn't know, I didn't have those tools until I entered grad school.
And started trying them out.
And started doing it for myself, and just because I felt safe in the environment at UW. So I think that should start earlier.
That's a good curriculum recommendation. Thanks. Lisa.
So yeah, building off of that, my question to the panel is, how do we teach ownership to our students? You speak a lot of the government, the federal government, Bush, FEMA, as if they're some higher power.
The government.
But I was taught when I was in school that we are the government, that we elect these people to make our decisions for us. And okay, maybe Bush was not elected the first time, but he was elected the second time. by American citizens. So how much of this are we teaching to the kids? Blame the government, these other people who you have no relation with, versus this is our country, take ownership. Even if you personally didn't vote for the people in power, you're still part of the system.
Right.
How do we teach them ownership?
We the people invaded Iraq. We the people blew it in Katrina.
We did. That's what I was taught to believe, that even if you didn't personally vote for that decision, that you have been part of that, either by buying in or not doing enough to change it, or just by choosing to be a member.
Anybody like to comment on that?
I'd like to comment on a couple things. A couple of things came up that I just have some kind of pragmatic, maybe, sort of responses to. One is about how to teach this material and not get, slammed or fired or whatever. And the other is about people not being prepared to teach it. I've been teaching at UW-Tacoma since 1990, and every year I teach the Black Freedom Movement, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, and Malcolm X as another class, labor history, and what have you. And almost without fail, every class people say, how come I didn't know this before? So these are people who have gone through K through 12 and community college, some of them, and they don't know any of these things. They know, Rosa Parks. They know a couple of basic things, but
they have the vocabulary, right? They know the word race. It's in their vocabulary.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean very much. I mean, the picture is not filled in for them. Basically, they don't know history. That's one of the biggest problems. But the history they do know is very skewed and doesn't address a lot of this. One of the things that, of course, teaching is one answer to that, but one of the things I started when I was the Harry Bridges Chair at the Center for Labor Studies at the UW campus was a series of seminars with K through 12 teachers meet with university faculty about what is labor history. And of course, labor history encompasses everything. It's race, class, gender, and imperialism and everything else. And so we built a kind of a core of people out of that over a number of years, and then it sort of lapsed. But I know that the people that we worked with, a number of them are still in the schools, and they're doing some pretty great things. And I wanted to transfer that to Tacoma. We were doing it here in Seattle. But it's hard to pull off. You need some institutional resources to do that. And it was just coming out of my hide as a faculty member instead. But I think there's a model there that I'm sure there are things like that going on, but I think we could bring it up to a higher level in terms of those kind of partnerships. And then secondly, that not only do we have this great curriculum on Katrina, but we should think about the opportunities that are automatically there. One of them is the Martin Luther King holiday, in which all the kids come in, they're so bored with I have a dream. And now the scholarship has shifted. Not so much I have a dream, but I've been to the mountaintop, and we as a people will get there. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. We have the opportunity now to use that as an educational forum that can open up all these issues. And I'll just be quick, but in this book, for instance, Going Down Jericho Road, there's a different king. There's a king who supports labor since he's a kid. There's a king who's always been opposed to war. There's a king who becomes more and more distraught over economic and social justice issues in the cities and poverty questions. There's a king who says things like this: we need a true revolution of values, a reordering of priorities to develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole, to join the world revolution on behalf of the poor, the colonized, the oppressed. Everyone must protest war, for silence is betrayal. I wear this button when I teach. It says silence is betrayal, which was King's speech denouncing the war. There's such a thing as being too late. If we do not act, we will surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. We have great texts to work with.
Which speech is that you're?
It's a number of them that I'm quoting from there. And he talks about the labor issues. And finally, we need a positive platform. So with King, we get a searing critique of American capitalism, really, and American foreign policy. Secondly, we get a solution, which is that King always believed in building mass coalitions. It's the same kind of thing Barack Obama is talking about now, that he says people of color have a very specific agenda, things need to be done. They're very clear what they are, but if you talk about them only in that framework, it's not going to happen. If you talk about it in the larger framework that Americans as a whole are losing out in the global economy, they're losing out in their own internal economy, we have to build a movement that brings everybody up and that has to address all of these disparities, then things will start to change. And we have that model, and Obama took it from King, obviously, and from the movements of the past. We have a history that is empowering. And the Your Child Left Behind thing, wants us to just teach narrow little things but we do have opportunities, I think, within the framework that we have. And specifically, I think we have a big opportunity between the UW and the K through 12 people to do a lot more than we're doing so that people are enabled to teach this material.
I just want to further layer education on top of it. When you said that silence is betrayal from King's speech, so what Paulo Freire says, there is no neutral educational process. You're either, I think I have the quote here, you're either an instrument of the status quo or a facilitator in the practice of freedom. And so what, these teachers saying, well, I'm just not going to do it. Well, you're actually making a choice there. Silence is betrayal. And so to help these teachers kind of push them off the fence a bit into some kind of space where they actually can take these risks without irreparable harm to their careers, I think would be incredibly valuable for the American citizenry.
We're approaching the end. Maybe one more from.
Well, I want to go back to your comments about when in reality can anything of this nature be taught when the teachers are so confined to preparing for tests. And I teach in the Bronx. I teach teacher education in the Bronx at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York. And the teachers I work with largely go into the Bronx schools. They do their observations in those schools. If social studies gets taught 20 minutes, maybe once a week, there's very little time. Everything is focused on these tests. So I think all of us around the country have to do something about getting it back. We've given it away. And I think partly it's teacher education has not been as effective as it should be. And we've found things to be kind of dictated to us. And I know the Board of Ed of New York City is exactly what your little passage talked about. $80 million for a computer system to track the assessment while there's no books in certain classes. I mean, it makes no sense.
I tend to be a kind of a glass half full guy, and so. Well, learned that from my dad, a politician. So it's like you want to be really sober about constraints. So what you were doing is laying out constraints, and they're becoming increasingly thick and high walls. So it's hard to work around them. But the glass half full point is that it's good to know rather precisely the constraints so that you can move among them, and so that you can look for openings. And I think there's actually a lot of openings here for really powerful work, and that is an expression of a glass half full, isn't it? That there are actually lots of openings, and the sobriety that's needed, I think, is around being terribly aware of the constraints, of actually the amount of racism that is so alive and well, the amount of classism that is so alive and well, the extraordinary ignorance of labor history that is so alive and well, the deflecting of the more powerful meanings of social justice and the conflating of it with caring, terrific example. it's so important to be aware of these so that we can perceive the openings where, and be smart about what move to make now. And I think different people in the audience, different people on the panel will have different understandings of which move to make now. The point, I would think, is for all of us to make some move now. Our time is up. Thank you for coming.
I'd like to just have the final word because I want to encourage you to buy the book before you leave. We did ask the bookstore to come, and they did, so please fulfill the obligation.
And the cost is very reasonable, right?
Yeah, we got you a good price.
What is it?
I don't know. I don't deal with prices, but
it's just $13.95,
yeah.
and that includes the Spike Lee DVD.
I don't think so. No.
No, but
No.
can I make a brief?
Yeah, please, Margaret.
Just a brief, yeah, that would be the bargain.
I thought
but
I saw an opening.
For all teachers, HBO has a new website called Watch It and Learn. And if you provide the right documentation, you can get any of their documentaries for $5. It's phenomenal. So $5, watch it and learn. You know, there's some rigmarole. They're very legalistic about the documentation you need, but you can do it. And so you can get it very cheaply. And I would just say that the curriculum is not a curriculum that has to be taught in its entirety, that these lessons all tie into standards for all of the national standards in social studies and media literacy. So you can do drop-in lessons and tie it into the stuff you're already teaching for Wassel.
Yeah, I want to do some special thanks. Walter Parker, my dear friend and colleague, who chaired this panel. Margaret Smith Parker, who came all the way from Teachers College, Columbia. I'm deeply indebted to Mike Honey, who drove a long ways, to my dear colleague, Joy Williams. Let's give them a round of applause.